The envelope of truth. Laura sat alone in the hospital corridor, her hands resting on her knees, her body still weak, but her mind strangely alert. The smell of antiseptic and the distant echo of footsteps blended into a sound she had learned to associate with both fear and survival. This was the place where she had cried, prayed, and silently prepared herself for death more times than she could count. The doctor emerged from his office holding a thin envelope. Her name was written on it. For a moment, Laura hesitated before standing up. Her heart pounded not with dread, but with a fragile hope she barely dared to acknowledge. She had learned not to celebrate too early. Cancer had taught her patience and cruelty. "Laura," the doctor said gently, offering a small smile. "The results are in." She took the envelope with trembling fingers. He spoke words about remission, about clean scans, about the future. But they reached her as if through water. All she could hear was one sentence,
repeating itself inside her head. "You're free." In the parking lot, Laura sat in her car and finally allowed herself to cry. Not from pain this time, but from relief so sharp it almost hurt. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, breathing deeply, imagining the moment she would tell Eduardo, her husband, and Camila, her sister. They had been by her side through every session, every collapse. They would be proud, happy, grateful. She wiped her tears, started the engine, and made a sudden decision. She wouldn't call them. She would surprise them instead. As Laura drove home, the envelope resting on the passenger seat like a quiet promise, she had no idea that the life waiting behind her front door was not the one she believed she had survived for, and that the people she trusted most were already preparing for her end. Before illness entered her life, Laura had been known for her quiet strength. She was the kind of woman people described as lucky, though few understood how much of that luck she had built with sacrifice. At 38, she had learned to place others before herself with a grace that felt almost natural. She listened more than she spoke, she gave without keeping score, and she believed, deeply, in loyalty. Her marriage to Eduardo was often cited as proof that good things happen to good people. He was a successful businessman, admired for his intelligence and discipline, a man whose name opened doors. At social events, Eduardo spoke with confidence while Laura stood beside him, elegant but discreet, letting him shine. She never minded. She believed marriage was a partnership, not a competition. Camila, her younger sister, was the one constant Laura had carried from childhood into adulthood. They had grown up sharing secrets, clothes, and dreams. When their parents struggled financially, Laura became Camila's protector. Even years later, that instinct remained. Camila was more impulsive, more fragile, or so Laura believed, and Laura felt responsible for her happiness. After Laura married Eduardo, Camila became part of their daily lives. Dinners, weekends, holidays, Camila was always welcome. Laura took comfort in that closeness. To her, it meant family had stayed intact. What Laura didn't see, what she never allowed herself to suspect, was how easily admiration could turn into entitlement. Eduardo admired Laura's devotion. Camila admired Laura's life. And admiration, unguarded, can quietly become desire. When the first symptoms appeared, fatigue, unexplained pain, Laura dismissed them as stress. There was always another meeting to attend with Eduardo, another problem Camila needed help solving. Laura kept moving forward, unaware that the foundation of her life was already beginning to crack. The diagnosis would soon change everything. But even then, Laura believed love would be enough to hold it all together. The diagnosis arrived without drama, without warning, just a sentence spoken calmly across a desk. Cancer. Laura stared at the doctor as if he had switched to another language. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. She nodded when he explained the treatment plan, the timelines, the probabilities. She asked practical questions. She smiled once, apologetically, as if she were inconveniencing everyone by being sick. It wasn't until she stepped outside that the world truly stopped. Her hand shook as she called Eduardo. His voice softened instantly, full of concern and urgency. He arrived at the hospital within minutes, pulling her into his arms, promising they would face everything together. Camilla came soon after, crying harder than Laura herself, repeating that everything would be fine. At first, Laura believed them. Chemotherapy began quickly. Days blurred into weeks of nausea, weakness, and an exhaustion that sank into her bones. Her hair fell out in clumps. Mirrors became enemies.
Nights were the worst, long hours filled with fear she rarely voiced. Eduardo attended every appointment. He learned medical terms, spoke to doctors, signed papers. In public, he became the image of devotion. Friends praised him. Laura felt grateful, even guilty, for doubting her own worth. Camila moved into the house temporarily. She cooked, cleaned, and stayed close, often sleeping in the guest room. She held Laura's hand during the worst moments and whispered encouragements that sounded sincere. Yet beneath the surface, something shifted. Laura noticed how Camila seemed increasingly comfortable in the house, how Eduardo deferred to her in small decisions, how conversations stopped abruptly when Laura entered a room. She blamed the chemotherapy, the fog in her mind, the paranoia illness often brings. "You're imagining things," she told herself. But illness strips away illusions, even as it creates new ones. As Laura grew weaker, Eduardo and Camila grew closer, not only in responsibility, but in presence. They shared looks that lasted a second too long. They spoke in lowered voices. They began to function as a unit. Laura, lying awake at night, felt a quiet fear she could not name. She believed it was fear of death. She was wrong. From the outside, Eduardo was flawless. At the hospital, nurses smiled at him with admiration. Doctors praised his involvement. Friends told Laura she was lucky to have such a devoted husband. Eduardo held her hand during consultations, spoke gently, kissed her forehead before every procedure. He learned exactly when to look worried and when to look hopeful. Laura clung to those moments. They were proof, she told herself, that love still surrounded her. At home, however, the silence was heavier. Eduardo spent more time on his phone, stepping outside to take calls. Camila answered questions before Laura could speak. Decisions were made quietly, then presented as fait accompli.
When Laura asked about finances or schedules, Eduardo reassured her with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "You focus on getting better," he would say. "We'll handle everything else." Camila echoed him, her voice soft, her touch familiar. She helps Laura bathe when her strength failed, brushed her thinning hair, adjusted her pillows at night. The intimacy felt comforting and unsettling. There were moments when Laura sensed she had become a guest in her own life. Small details began to accumulate. Doors closed when she approached, laughter that stopped too suddenly. Eduardo and Camila sitting closer than necessary on the couch, their shoulders almost touching. Laura noticed, then immediately scolded herself for noticing it all. "You're sick," she thought. "You're tired. Don't poison what little peace you have left." Still, doubt settled quietly inside her, like dust. One afternoon, Laura woke from a nap and heard voices in the kitchen. Eduardo and Camila were talking in low tones. She couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, the familiarity. When she entered the room, they turned toward her at the same time, smiling too quickly. "How are you feeling?" Camila asked. "Better," Laura replied automatically. She wasn't sure if it was true. At night, lying beside Eduardo, Laura felt the space between them grow. He slept facing away from her, his body tense, distant. She told herself it was stress, fear, exhaustion. Love, she believed, simply took different shapes under pressure. She did not yet understand that some silences were not born of fear, but of secrets carefully protected. The final chemotherapy session arrived quietly. There were no speeches, no dramatic farewells to the infusion room, only Laura, sitting in the same chair she had occupied so many times before, watching the clear liquid drip slowly into her veins. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was strangely calm. She had learned not to hope too loudly. When the treatment ended, the nurse smiled and said, "You did well." Laura nodded, too tired to respond. Later that afternoon, the doctor asked her to sit down. He reviewed the scans, the blood tests, the numbers that had once terrified her. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes. "There is no sign of active disease," he said. "You're in remission." The words settled slowly, like snow. Laura didn't scream or laugh. She felt something gentler, almost sacred, unfold inside her. A sense of being returned to herself. She thanked the doctor, accepted the paperwork, and walked out holding the results against her chest. Outside, she stood alone for several minutes, letting the truth sink in. She was alive. Her first instinct was to call Eduardo. The second was to call Camilla. She imagined their reactions, the relief, the tears, the embrace waiting at home. But something stopped her. A quiet instinct, new, fragile, and unfamiliar, whispered caution. Laura slipped the envelope into her bag. She decided to wait, just a little longer. She wanted to see their faces when she told them, wanted the joy to be real, unfiltered. She drove home slowly, sunlight spilling across the dashboard, her heart lighter than it had been in months. For the first time since the diagnosis, the future did not feel like a threat. As she turned onto her street, Laura smiled. She had no idea that the people she planned to surprise had already assumed the ending of her story, and that her cure was the last thing they expected to hear. Laura parked the car a few houses away from home. She wasn't sure why, perhaps habit, perhaps instinct, but she wanted to savor the moment before stepping inside. The envelope rested in her bag, its presence warm and reassuring, like a secret meant to be shared. The front door was unlocked. As she stepped into the house, she noticed the lights were dimmer than usual. Music played softly from the living room. She smiled, imagining Eduardo trying to make the house feel welcoming, normal. Then she heard laughter. It wasn't the gentle, careful laughter she had grown used to during her illness. It was light, unguarded, almost celebratory. Laura slowed her steps, her smile fading as the sound grew clearer. Voices drifted toward the hallway. Eduardo's voice, Camila's voice. Laura stopped just before the living room entrance, unseen. On the coffee table stood an open bottle of champagne and 2 glasses, half full. Eduardo sat relaxed, his jacket tossed aside. Camila sat beside him, her legs crossed, her posture intimate. Eduardo raised his glass. "It won't be long now," he said casually. "The doctors already expect the worst." Camila laughed softly. "You've been very patient," she replied. "Soon, everything will finally be ours." Laura felt her breath leave her body. Eduardo leaned closer to Camila, lowering his voice just enough to feel conspiratorial. "Once it's over, the company transfers to me. The properties will be split, no complications." "And Laura?" Camila asked. Eduardo shrugged. "She won't know. She barely understands what she's signing anymore." They clinked glasses. Laura pressed her hand against the wall to keep from collapsing. Her mind refused to process the scene before her. Her husband, her sister, celebrating her death as if it were a business milestone. Camila smiled. "She trusts us completely." "That's what makes it easy," Eduardo replied. A wave of nausea hit her, sharper than any chemotherapy side effect. The betrayal was absolute, emotional, physical, financial. They weren't just waiting for her to die. They were planning to profit from it. Laura stepped back silently, every movement controlled by shock and instinct. She left the house without making a sound, the envelope in her bag suddenly feeling heavier than ever. She sat in her car and stared at the front door. Inside, they were toasting to her death. And she had never been more alive. Laura did not drive right away. She sat in the car with both hands gripping the steering wheel, her chest tight, her thoughts racing in chaotic circles. The scene replayed again and again. Eduardo's relaxed posture, Camila's laughter, the careless cruelty of their words. Each repetition cut deeper than the last. She expected tears, screams, rage. Instead, there was a strange, hollow calm. When she finally drove, she didn't go far. She parked in a quiet street nearby and turned off the engine. The envelope slipped from her bag onto the passenger seat. She stared at it for a long time. "I'm cured," she thought. "They don't know." The realization settled slowly, reshaping her pain into something sharper, something focused. That night, Laura did not go home. She checked into a small hotel under a different name, her body exhausted, but her mind painfully awake. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence she had been denied for months. She thought about every sacrifice she had made, every moment of trust, every time she had defended them in her own mind. By morning, grief had transformed into resolve. They believed she was weak. They believed she was fading. They believed time was on their side. Laura smiled faintly for the first time since the diagnosis. She would let them keep believing. At dawn, she stood in front of the mirror, studying her reflection. Pale, thinner, fragile. It was the version of herself they expected to see. And she would give it to them. Laura returned home later that morning, moving slowly, leaning into the role she now understood all too well. Eduardo rushed to her side, concern etched across his face. Camila hollowed, her voice soft, apologetic. Laura lowered her eyes and whispered, "I'm tired." It was not a lie, but it was no longer the whole truth. That night marked the end of Laura as a victim, and the quiet beginning of something far more dangerous. From that day on,
Laura perfected her disappearance. She moved through the house like a shadow, present yet unnoticed. Her steps were slow, her voice softer than ever. She allowed Eduardo to guide her by the arm, allowed Camila to speak for her during conversations. To them, she was exactly what they expected: weakened, dependent, fading. And that was her greatest advantage. Eduardo grew more confident. He spoke freely around her, assuming the fog of illness had dulled her awareness. He discussed schedules, meetings, future arrangements, never bothering to lower his voice. Camila mirrored his ease, slipping into Laura's life as if it already belonged to her. Laura listened. She watched how Eduardo signed documents at the dining table, how Camila sorted through papers she had no business touching. She noticed how their hands brushed, how their eyes met in unguarded moments. Each detail etched itself into her memory. At night, when the house fell silent, Laura became someone else. She searched drawers, photographed contracts, recorded conversations on her phone hidden beneath pillows or folded blankets. She memorized account numbers, noted dates, traced patterns. Her mind, once clouded by pain, was sharp again. Eduardo began encouraging her to sign protective documents. "Just in case," he said gently, "so everything is easier later." Laura hesitated at the right moments. She asked simple questions, played confused, then signed when reassured. Each signature became another thread in the web she was quietly weaving. Camila sat beside her during these moments, offering comfort, squeezing her hand. The intimacy made Laura's stomach turn, but she never pulled away. Instead, she smiled weakly. They mistook her silence for surrender. What they didn't see was the strength returning to her posture, the clarity behind her lowered gaze. Laura was no longer waiting to survive. She was waiting to strike. And with every day that passed, Eduardo and Camila grew more careless, more certain that the ending they had planned was inevitable. They never questioned the woman they believed was disappearing. The closer Eduardo and Camila believed they were to the end, the less cautious they became. They talked openly now, about properties, about timelines, about how the company would be restructured after everything was over. Laura listened from the edges of rooms, her presence so expected, so insignificant, that it barely registered. She documented everything: every suspicious transfer, every altered contract,
every message that passed between Eduardo and Camila when they thought no one was watching. Late at night, Laura met quietly with a lawyer recommended by an old family friend. She wore a scarf and glasses, careful to avoid recognition. She spoke calmly, laying out facts instead of emotions. The lawyer listened, asked precise questions, and nodded slowly. "You've done the right thing by waiting," he told her.
But timing will matter. Laura understood that now better than anyone. Back home, Eduardo began testing his control more openly. He suggested moving certain assets for security reasons. Camila encouraged Laura to rest, to stop worrying about details that were too much for her condition. Laura nodded. She rested. She signed what she was meant to sign, and copied everything afterward. One afternoon, she overheard Eduardo on the phone. "She won't last long," he said, his voice low but steady. "The family is prepared." Laura stood behind the door, recording, her hands steady despite the cold spreading through her chest. That single sentence was worth more than any document. Camila, emboldened, began speaking as if the future were already theirs. She discussed renovations, trips, a life beyond Laura, sometimes even in her presence. Laura responded with silence and a faint smile. With each lie they told, they built her case for her. The evidence grew heavy: files, recordings,
Photographs, organized carefully, backed up twice, stored away from the house. Laura felt a grim satisfaction as the pieces came together. She wasn't rushing anymore. She was preparing. And when she finally decided to speak, there would be nowhere left for them to hide. Laura chose her moment carefully. One evening, as the three of them sat at the dining table, she pushed her food aside and rested her hands in her lap. Her shoulders were slumped, her breathing shallow, every detail rehearsed. Eduardo looked at her with practiced concern. Camila watched closely, already alert. "I've been thinking," Laura said softly. "I don't know how much time I have left." Eduardo reached for her hand immediately. "Don't talk like that." But he didn't stop her. "I want one last dinner," Laura continued, "with everyone. My parents, the family. I just want to see them all together." Camila's eyes filled with tears on cue. "Of course," she whispered. "That's a beautiful idea." Eduardo nodded slowly, already calculating. A public farewell fit perfectly into the story he had been telling everyone. It would make him look devoted, grieving, noble. "We'll arrange everything," he said. "Whatever you want." Laura smiled faintly, lowering her gaze. Over the following days, preparations began. Eduardo called relatives, his voice heavy with sorrow. Camila took charge of details: flowers, seating, the menu, acting like a woman already stepping into a role that wasn't hers yet. The family responded as expected: sympathy, pity, whispered conversations. Laura received long hugs, sad looks, hands lingering as if memorizing her. She played her part perfectly. She grew quieter, weaker. She spoke of memories, of gratitude, of peace. Eduardo began sleeping poorly, rehearsing his role as a widower. Camila hovered constantly, protective, possessive. Neither of them noticed the calm behind Laura's eyes. To them, this dinner was an ending. To Laura, it was a stage.
And once everyone was seated at that table, there would be no escape from the truth she had been carrying in silence. The house had never looked more beautiful. Candles lined the dining table, their flames steady and respectful. Fresh flowers filled the room with a faint, sweet scent. Every detail spoke of care, of reverence, of an unspoken goodbye. Family members arrived quietly, voices lowered, movements cautious, as if sound itself might break Laura. She entered the room slowly, supported by Eduardo's arm. Her face was pale, her steps measured. The room fell silent as she took her seat at the head of the table. This was her place. Her parents sat across from her, eyes shining with unshed tears. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all gathered with expressions of sorrow and helplessness. Camila moved gracefully among them, offering water, touching shoulders, playing the role of the devoted sister.
Eduardo stood when everyone was seated. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began.
His voice carefully strained. "Laura has fought harder than anyone I know. These past months have been difficult." He paused, lowering his head. "The doctors say the coming weeks will be critical." A murmur passed through the table. Laura's mother pressed a hand to her mouth. Camila reached for Laura's hand, squeezing it gently, as if in shared grief. Laura said nothing. Eduardo continued, speaking of love, of strength, of acceptance. He spoke as though he had already let her go. Each word was polished, rehearsed, designed to inspire sympathy. Laura watched him closely. She noticed the subtle confidence in his posture, the way Camila nodded along, tears perfectly timed. They were calm now, secure. This was the moment they had been preparing for. When Eduardo finally sat down, the silence stretched. Laura lifted her glass of water with steady hands. "I'd like to say something," she said softly. Every eye turned toward her. Eduardo stiffened almost imperceptibly.
Camila smiled, encouraging. Laura looked around the table, meeting each gaze in turn. She took a slow breath. For a moment, it seemed as though she might collapse. Instead, she straightened. Her hand moved to her head. The room held its breath. Laura slowly removed her hand from the table and reached up, grasping the edge of her scarf. The gesture was simple, unremarkable, yet the room seemed to freeze as she pulled it away. Then she removed her wig, placing it gently beside her plate. She lifted her head. "I'm cured," she said calmly. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Eduardo's face drained of color. Camila's fingers slipped from Laura's hand. Chairs creaked as people shifted, confused, searching for explanation. Laura reached into her bag and placed the medical reports on the table. "The scans are clean. The cancer is gone." Her mother let out a broken sob, half relief, half disbelief. Murmurs rippled through the room. Eduardo stood abruptly. "Laura."
"This isn't the time." "Yes," she interrupted, her voice steady. "It is." She pressed a button on her phone. Eduardo's voice filled the room. "Once it's over, the company transfers to me. She barely understands what she's signing anymore." Camila's voice followed. "She trusts us completely." Gasps echoed around the table. Camila stepped back as if struck, shaking her head. "That's not—" Laura didn't look at her. She played another recording, then another. Messages appeared on the screen. Documents passed from hand to hand. Each piece landed with quiet precision. "I stayed silent," Laura said, standing now, her posture firm. "Not because I was weak, but because I needed the truth to speak for itself." Eduardo collapsed into his chair. Camila's sobs came too late, too hollow. "You celebrated my death," Laura continued. "You planned your future on my absence." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But I never left." The room was silent, heavy, irrevocable.
Laura gathered her things and looked one last time at the two people who had betrayed her. "I have never been more alive," she said, and with that, she walked away. The consequences came swiftly. By the following morning, the illusion Eduardo had built for years was in ruins. Lawyers moved faster than sympathy ever could. Accounts were frozen, contracts were reviewed. The recordings Laura had shared were no longer private weapons, they were evidence. Eduardo was removed from the company he once ruled with confidence. Board members who had applauded him weeks earlier now avoided his calls. Investigations followed, quiet at first, then unmistakable. His name became something people spoke carefully, if at all. Camila's fall was more personal. Laura's parents refused to see her. Messages went unanswered, invitations stopped coming. The sister who had once been welcomed everywhere now stood alone. Her explanations met with silence or disbelief. The family did not argue.
They did not shout. They simply closed the door. Laura watched all of this from a distance. She did not interfere. She did not celebrate. There was no triumph in her expression, only a calm acceptance. Justice, she understood now, did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it came quietly, piece by piece,
dismantling lives built on lies. Eduardo tried to reach her once. The message was short, desperate, unanswered. Laura deleted it without hesitation. She had given them trust. They had turned it into a weapon. Now, stripped of status, money, and family, they were left with nothing but the truth they had tried to hide. And Laura, finally free from them both, felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Peace. Laura left the house a week later. She packed lightly, only what belonged to her, only what mattered. The rooms no longer felt heavy, but they were no longer hers either. Every wall carried echoes of a life she had survived, not one she wished to continue inhabiting.
Outside, the air felt different, cleaner, real. She moved into a small apartment across the city, far from familiar streets and curious eyes. There, mornings were quiet. No whispered conversations behind closed doors. No careful performances. Just sunlight through bare windows and the steady rhythm of breath returning to her body. Her recovery continued, no longer defined by fear. She walked each day, strength returning slowly, deliberately. Scars remained, on her body, in her memory, but they no longer defined her. Occasionally, people asked how she had endured it all. Laura never gave a long answer. She had learned that survival was not just about staying alive. It was about choosing yourself when others had already decided you were expendable. One evening, as she watched the city lights flicker on, Laura touched the faint scar near her collarbone and smiled. It was proof of pain, but also of endurance. They had waited for her death to claim her life. Instead, she had lived.
And in doing so, she had reclaimed everything that truly mattered. Not the fortune, not the house, but herself.